This is the first of 2 lectures where we're going to take a look at slavery. Political, social, cultural, economic institution and system that absolutely was present before the founding of the British North American colonies, but definitely becomes a big part of the fabric of these colonies and eventually the United States. And in this lecture, we're going to be taking a look more at the economic side of things. So what we're seeing on the map, we got the Atlantic Ocean in the middle, and bear in mind that this is a highly simplified version of this system, but this is commonly referred to as a triangular trade. And we have, 4 continents that are directly involved within it, each hemisphere. So we have North America and South America in the Western Hemisphere, Europe and Africa that are in the Eastern Hemisphere. And again, this is highly simplified, but it goes as follows. You can see in the top, kind of in pink lettering, that we have raw materials, and the examples given are sugar, cotton, and tobacco. In our last lecture, when we took a look at mercantilism, you have colonies expected to provide these raw materials for the mother country. So the pure sugar, the pure cotton, the tobacco, the timber, these items are transported from North America and South America, so the Western Hemisphere, over to Britain, to France, wherever the mother country happens to be. When they are in, we might use the phrase factories, but when they're in places that the goods can be processed, they're turned into something else. We call these manufactured goods, things that are made from other stuff. So in this case, raw materials go to Europe and they're turned into something else. This something else ends up being transported to West Africa. Once in West Africa, these manufactured goods are traded for people. And, it says enslaved Africans on the map. That's something that's very important to remember. We're dealing with individuals. We're dealing with people. So this economic system, mercantilism, as it plays out in practice, also becomes known as this triangular trade. And admittedly, sometimes people sort of like to see it written down. So Europe, Africa, South America, North America. The economics of forced labor. With this triangular trade, the common simplification is that South and North America provided the raw materials, Europe provides the finished goods, and Africa provided the labor. Just economically speaking, this is what we're looking at. Now, the year 1450, we're using it as a starting point because this is when the Portuguese first negotiated contracts with local rulers in West Africa that allowed them, the Portuguese, to build small armed trading posts in West African territories. Now, they began by settling and bringing slaves to work in lands like the Azores, which are a series of islands in the Atlantic, as well as Madeiras, which is another island off the coast of Africa, but eventually the Canary Islands become a part of this. Now, the Spanish eventually took over the Azores, and sugar does become the primary crop that was grown in tropical areas. Within the United States, there's this perception that cotton was the driver behind chattel slavery. Cotton doesn't really begin to take a lot of prominence until the very late 1790s and then into the 1800s. For centuries, the name of the game was sugar. And these Spaniards used plantation methods developed in the Arab world to harvest the sugarcane, and they used merchants to facilitate the trade. And sugar could actually be transported long distances and not really have much spoilage, so that's why it was considered such a commodity. Now, the so-called Middle Passage was the longest part of the journey across the Atlantic and led to countless deaths. The problem is that as you're making this part of the journey, the equatorial winds, so winds kind of near the equator, were very unpredictable. So ships could be stranded for weeks. And the individual you see on screen, Olaudah Equiano, he published a personal narrative of his time as a slave when he was captured in West Africa, when he was forced to wait on the coast for his forced passage, and then when he was a slave and eventually became free. This personal narrative tells us much about what potential slaves endured on the voyage westward. And, you get a look at some of the numbers. It's hard to get an accurate gauge, but we believe about 12.5 million in total were forced from West Africa to the Western Hemisphere. About 2 million didn't make it. Like 2 million died on the voyage over. And only about 450,000 went to what became the United States. Which it sounds really weird and harsh to say only 450,000, because that's a huge number. But the vast majority went to Central and South America to work the brutal conditions on sugar plantations. It was stated that the life of a slave in British North America could be measured in years. If you were in the Caribbean or South America, it was measured in months. And to get an idea of how this truly was part of a global system, we have different slave trade routes that are here. So on the eastern part of the map, we have East African slave trade. We have Red Sea slave trade, Trans-Saharan. But in terms of the sheer volume, when you take a look at the map, the thicker the arrow, the higher the volume of slaves. So most of them are going to have their final destination be in the Caribbean, like in the West Indies, or in Brazil. So again, this just gives us an idea of how this system began when we look at it purely for economic purposes.